Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm going to try my best to project so that you all can hear me. Thank you, Crystal, for inviting me to the event. I just wanted to quickly give sort of a self-introduction before moving into the topic at hand. So I am Renee, as Crystal mentioned, otherwise known as Navajo. I was born in Arizona. I've always lived sort of on the periphery of Navajo territories. My father is white, and I've lived in New York since about 2007. I currently study at the CUNY Graduate Center in the English program, and my focus in my research there is a little bit different than what I'm talking about today. I'm mostly focused on the intersections of the transatlantic slave trade and settler colonialism and the formation of racial categories. But today, as Crystal mentioned, I'm speaking on colonial gender violence, and you'll notice that the name of the segment today is called First Women, Then the Nation. This title comes from an essay that I wrote a few years ago when I was trying to work through some thoughts on Idle No More and the Violence Against Women Act, which was also a topic of discussion around that time. And generally, I was just thinking about the fundamental role that gender violence plays in establishing the sovereignty of the settler colonial state. So a large part of my presentation tonight comes from that essay, and if you're interested in reading the whole thing, it's in a journal called Lies, a journal of materialist feminism. So if you want to check it out, there's also a lot of other great essays in there, free plugs. So First Women, Then the Nation, that title, refers to what many Indigenous scholars before me have identified as one of the techniques of settler colonialism. And this technique involves establishing Indigenous women and otherwise deviantly gendered people as a class of people, and then attacking them as a means of destabilizing any claims by Indigenous people to a nation and the intended lands or lifeways that are associated with that nation. So we can see gender, labor, and the stealing of land for a foreign imposed sovereign force. These all occur in North America in such a way that Native women especially experience violence at extraordinarily higher rates than non-Native women. And it also contributes to the sociological problem of murdered and missing women, which many of you have heard about as a problem in Canada. It's also something that happens in the United States. And many of the statistics for these realities can be found in the Amnesty International report that's on the syllabus. I'm not really going to go through them now, but rest assured there's very hard evidence sort of charting the ways in which Native women will experience higher rates of sexual violence and violence throughout their lives. That is sort of the main thrust of my talk tonight. That is specifically by attacking, raping, and killing Indigenous women that settler societies and governments attempt to gain control of Indigenous lands. So like I said, I wrote this essay a few years ago, and one of the reasons that I was compelled to write it was that it seemed to me that the discussion about violence against women, and to me the obviously gendered nature of resource extraction and settler colonial violence, which is itself inseparable from settler colonial rule. So we have to understand that settler colonial governance is always violence. And I thought that the discussion of violence against women in these larger movements was always an afterthought, if not thought at all. That's definitely changed to some degree, as evidenced in part right by the fact that this segment is part of this event tonight. And I think that we are all sort of starting to understand gender violence as one of these praxis of the settler colonial state, which is being protested at Standing Rock and globally as part of Indigenous resistance movements. So just as that discourse has changed, a lot of my own thoughts around some of these issues have shifted and morphed. But some of the main points about the centrality of gender violence to the settler colonial project, and particularly resource extraction, remain. So tonight I'll be discussing these main points. One, settler colonial logic represents Indigenous women as violable, able to be violated, and the lands their bodies are positioned on as similarly available for exploitation. Rape, sexual violence, and gender categorization itself have gone hand in hand with the establishment of settler sovereignty over territory. This is in part because of the need for sovereignty to produce its own legitimacy through violence. So related to this is the understanding that resource extraction creates situations of increased gender violence while also depending on the logics that animate gender violence. And we can also see these logics working just in the sort of the allocation of state resources. So that, in Canada there is unending money for development projects, but there are not enough resources for inquiries into why so many women are murdered and missing. So we see the ways in which state resources are always directed towards the accumulation of more resources, and in doing that, devaluing particular lives. The other aspect that I want to address is decolonial options for resisting gender violence. And this for me includes a commitment to really understanding gender violence as something that seeks to create hierarchies of human lives according to how closely they approximate the colonial gender system. So I want to sort of integrate maybe not so much a warning, but just like a commitment to understand that indigenous movements must be careful not to internalize these hierarchies. So this means that we understand that gendered violence is not just something that is experienced by cis women, but that is also experienced by two-spirit people and trans women and gender non-conforming people. Began writing this when there were two sort of central events on my mind. The first is that on December 11th, 2012, Ottawa-Piscat Chief Teresa Spence began a hunger strike. Some of you might remember this as sort of a turning point in the Idle No More movement, and a point where it started to get more both attention in Canada and internationally. So Chief Spence demanded to meet with both the Canadian government and with the representative of the British Crown, under whose authority the treaties that currently structure Indian-Canadian relations were made. Her hunger strike was a bold and definitive illustration of how it is women's bodies and women's leadership that are so degraded by colonial society, while also being so crucial to the survival of Indigenous people. In an essay included in the Standing Rock syllabus called "The State is a Man" by professor here at Columbia, Audra Simpson, she discusses the vitriol and the criticism that was directed at Chief Spence during this time. Her hunger strike and the unwillingness of the Canadian press, the state, and large swaths of the settler citizenry to take it seriously indicates a disregard not only for her, but the land that she was putting her body on the line for. And her being a woman in particular, who dared to make her body a site of collective resistance and a very public site, is in what particular became such a threat to the illegitimately constructed patriarchal rule of the lands that are now called Canada. And we know this too. We know that in a certain way that this colonial logic is correct. She is a threat, and it is Native women who are a threat to colonial society. It is Native women who hold together movements, who lead movements, who shape movements. And it's precisely because of this that the state works so hard and has to work so hard to reproduce the ideology that Native women are less than. So I think that's just something to understand, is that the reason the state works so hard and that citizens who attack Native women are often let off by the state is because they represent a source of power. So there's a tendency, I think, and I'm guilty of this myself, right, to sort of fall into the rejection of the Native woman as a victim. But the reason that the Native woman is victimized is because she is a source of strength. So it's just something that I think should always sort of be on the flip side of these conversations. But this attitude of degrading Native women becomes all too clear in acts of sexual violence. So the other event that was on my mind, sort of in tandem with Chief Spence's hunger strike, was a brutal case of sexual assault in Thunder Bay that occurred just 6 days after she had started her hunger strike. So in this case, a 36-year-old First Nations woman was walking to the store in the Ontario city of Thunder Bay. Two men pulled over and forced her into the truck and sexually assaulted her and beat her while explicitly telling her that Indians didn't deserve treaty rights. So the men specifically told their victim that they had attacked Native women before and that they planned to do so again. This created sort of the state of emergency in Thunder Bay. Students were given emergency whistles to walk home with, and people were sort of put on high alert. This was obviously a response to the ratcheting up of idle no more actions at the time. And as of today, the rapist identities remain unknown. So I don't want to simply list the atrocities committed against Native women. There's one other case I would like to turn to because it's listed in the syllabus. And this one comes from the writer Shireen Razak, who, like I said, you'll find a chapter from an edited collection in the syllabus where she writes on the death of a First Nations woman, Pamela George. But I think that while not wanting to get into, like I said, like the laundry list of atrocities, I think it is important to stress what lies at the root of these attacks. So the violent drive of the settler colony for control over native bodies and lands, which are always constructed as unruly or a threat. So Shireen Razak examines how sexual assault against Native women's bodies bolsters white settler men's sense of their own masculinity and their control over physical spaces. These physical spaces are often represented by the bodies of Native women. So similar to the settler government's violent relationship to the land, the sexual assailant relates to Native women as objects to be contained, exploited, and disposed of. So through their violent acts, these Native men attack the physical bodies of those people whose presence on the land is inconvenient for them. Razak explains that while it is certainly patriarchy that produces men whose sense of identity is achieved through brutalizing a woman, sexual assault against Native women in particular confirms their national identity as men entitled to the land and full benefits of citizenship. So I think what's interesting about this, right, is that Shireen Razak isn't just sort of trying to get at what drives the sexual assailant, but really what separates colonial sexual violence, what makes it particular in this case, and therefore slightly different from what we conceive of as sexual violence. And so we can start to see the ways in which Native women are especially targeted as victims. I also wanted to mention that this sort of metaphor, this metaphorical logic that collapses Native women's bodies and lands, something that's also talked about by Black Studies scholar Tiffany King, and she relates the relationship between violence against enslaved Black women and the continuing devaluing of Black women's lives today as also part of the settler master's formation as a property holding subject. So we have to see the relationship between violence against Black women, which persists in the afterlife of slavery, as connected to violence against Native women, and the ways in which these things affirm settler men's sense of being able to have property and control over land. So this relates to private property in more than one sense. And there are resources out there that also relate to a sort of similar epidemic of missing Black women in the United States. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Hopefully what I've said so far has started to show the ways in which colonial logics about land and women's bodies have worked in tandem to facilitate the dispossession of indigenous lands for the increasing of settler wealth and the securing of settler national identity. I want to talk a little bit in conclusion about how we respond to colonial gender violence. So the hierarchy, there is often a hierarchy of innocence that silently underlies discourse around indigenous victims of gender violence, not just by sort of white civil society or mainstream media, but within our own movements. So I think that movements themselves will often neglect those marred by a lack of respectability in order to make their demands or appeals more palpable. If our movements fail to account or fight for sex workers, prison inmates, the homeless, the mentally ill, the addicts, we will only be reinforcing the twisted values of the settler colonial state and its conception of which people deserve to live full lives. I don't have time to really get into it, but there is also a really important essay in the syllabus from a Native trans daughter that looks at the ways in which the carceral state targets people because of so-called gender deviance, as well as people who are racialized as indigenous. And on a final note, a lot of people have stressed the nonviolent nature of the current protests at Standing Rock and throughout Idle No More and subsequent road blockades. And I am fully empathetic and often side with nonviolent protest movements. It's also atrocious that the police would attack unarmed people. But I think if there were to be an armed resistance at Standing Rock or at any place in which Indigenous people are fighting for their lands, I would fully support it. Related to my idea also that women and queer should have access to all available means of defending themselves. And that no matter what methods of force we use against settler colonial violence, our understandings and actions against the death drive of the settler colonial state must affirm mostly the lives and powers of women, two-spirit, and trans people. Those whose very lives and relations manifest the reality that things can be otherwise.